In this video, we will look at 4 different qualitative research methods, and we will look briefly at the characteristics of these different methods and when it is appropriate to use each of these methods in order to understand how we can choose between these research methods. And that choice depends largely on our research question and the kind of knowledge that we seek to gain in the research project that we are doing. The 4 research methods that we will look at in this video are individual interviews, group interviews or focus groups, observation, and textual analysis. And these different research methods, they help you to develop different kinds of knowledge. In individual interviews and group interviews, focus groups, you can get knowledge about what people say, what they tell you about their experiences, their views, their perceptions of different things. Using observation, you can get knowledge about what people actually do, because what they tell you in an interview and what they actually do might be different things. Not because people try to lie in an interview, but because there's a lot of things we do in our daily life that we are not so conscious about. And observing people can then be a good way of getting access to that kind of knowledge. And textual analysis can be useful in order to be able to learn more about those things that cannot be observed and those things that we cannot ask questions about in an interview, but that we can interpret and gain knowledge about by analyzing various types of texts. First of all, let's look at individual interviews. And these are often called semi-structured interviews or in-depth interviews. And I will use these 3 terms interchangeably in this and future videos. Individual interviews are useful when you want to gain knowledge about individuals' thoughts, opinions, perceptions, and experiences related to a specific topic. To know and learn more about their life world, so to speak, and to get rich and detailed answers where these individuals, your interviewees or research participants, can use their own words in order to express these thoughts and perceptions and experiences. It could be to do research on poor people and their experiences of living in poverty, to be able to go behind the statistics and to understand better what is it like to be poor in Norway in 2020. It could be to do interviews with immigrants on their thoughts and experiences with adapting to a new cultural context. Or it could be to interview specific people who've been part of an organization in order to understand the work of that organization and the role of the individuals in that work. In individual interviews, and this is especially in semi-structured interviews, that's why it's called semi-structured, it's common to have an interview guide with some pre-defined or at least pre-prepared questions that are open-ended. Questions that allow free and detailed answers. These are not survey questions with closed answers. These are questions that people can reply to using their own words. And these questions are often sorted under different topics so that there is some kind of structure to the interview before it starts. But there's a lot of flexibility. The phrasing and sequencing of the questions will vary from one interview to the other, so that these questions are not always asked in the same order. Some questions are not asked at all because the interview will respond or talk about what you want them to talk about using this question without you actually asking the question. And interviews may bring up new topics. You have to ask some follow-up questions. And as a researcher, you might also bring up new questions in future interviews as you learn during the process of doing research. So there's a lot of flexibility in doing individual interviews. The second research method is group interviews or focus groups. And I will say a little bit about the differences in terminology here, because sometimes group interviews and focus groups, these 2 terms are used interchangeably in the research methods literature. Others will use these terms very distinctively. And when there's a distinction being made between group interviews and focus group, the way these terms are distinguished is that a group interview means that you interview several people at the same time, and the researcher will ask questions to the different participant and have a very active role in the interview. So asking one question to one person, then the same question to the next person, etc. In a focus group, the researcher has a less active role. The researcher is more of a moderator. It's the participants who discuss among themselves. They are often given a topic or a task to accomplish together, and there's more emphasis on the discussion and interaction among the people participating in a focus group. Of course, in practice, if you're doing some kind of group interview or focus group, you might actually combine these two types. You might start with a more of a group interview where you ask questions to several participants, and then have more of a focus group discussion where you give people a task and you let them discuss among themselves while you step back as a researcher and more moderate the discussion, making sure that everyone gets to say something if they want to say something, steering the conversation if people go off track, etc. And group interviews or focus groups are useful in order to gain knowledge about not individual opinions, but shared opinions, experiences, norms or perceptions within a group. And in group interviews and focus group, because data is generated through the interaction and discussion between participants, you can get very rich data, because that group dynamic can generate more information than if you interview people individually. Because when people talk together, they often get new thoughts. They remember personal experiences that they had themselves because someone else shares a similar experience. They get different kinds of associations. That can, of course, happen in an individual interview as well, but the presence of several people often reinforces that effect. And people might also start discussing among themselves, and you might see how people respond to a view that's being shared, how they argue and bring out their own views, etc. But it also means that the composition of the group and the group dynamic will to a large extent influence what kind of data or knowledge you get through using this method. It's harder to ask follow-up questions than in individual interviews. It's harder to get access to very personal, sensitive topics that people might not feel comfortable talking about or sharing about in a group. So sometimes group interviews or focus groups can be a good choice. At other times, individual interviews are more appropriate for answering a research question. Thirdly, observation. Observation means that you observe and or participate in people's lives and social settings. You can take different roles, being more of an observer or more of a participant. We'll talk more about this in a later video. And you will also be given different roles by the people in the setting you study. But the aim is that you are there, you're observing, and might also be participating in people's natural social environment or setting. And I've written natural in quotation marks here because it's, although you might be observing students in a classroom or youth at the youth club or people in a company when they're having a meeting. So it's a natural setting. It's not a setting that you as a researcher are creating. Your presence in that setting might influence how people behave. And it's also you as a researcher who decides what aspects of that setting you will record as data and how you will interpret that data. So it's not a 100% natural setting. But still, observation is very useful to get access to information and to be able to yourself take part in those social settings that people are part of, and not just having people talk about these settings in an interview. Using observation, you can then get knowledge about people's actions and their interactions with others. You can learn more about things that people take for granted, and they might not say something about this in an interview because they're not so conscious about it. There's a lot of things we do as part of our everyday routine that we are not so conscious about. For instance, asking a teacher, how do they prepare for a class, or how do they deal with difficult situations that arise in a class? They might not have a very specific vocabulary to talk about this in an interview, but they will probably do something in an actual classroom setting that you can observe. By spending time with people in their natural context, you get access to this kind of tacit knowledge that people are not able to articulate because it's so common sense to the people you are observing, so everyday or normal that they don't even think about this as interesting to you for you as a researcher. Observation can also be useful for gaining access to knowledge about issues that are sensitive, that people might be reluctant to discuss in an interview. It could be conflicts in a workplace that people wouldn't raise in an interview, but that you might learn more about using observation. Then, of course, it's important to think about the research ethics of what you are doing. And we'll talk more about research ethics in a future video. So that in using observation, you get closer to people's lives worlds, and you get access to those things that are hard to ask questions about in an interview. Of course, there are not all situations that you can observe. Then interviews might be a useful method. And there are also situations that might be ethically difficult or impossible to observe, where interviews are a useful method. Of course, you can also not do observation of the past. So then interviews are a more appropriate method. And observation can also be quite time-consuming, and it can also be experienced as more intrusive for the people you are doing research on or with than interviews, because you are part of their natural environment. You're not just interviewing them for an hour and two and then letting them continue their lives. Lastly, textual analysis. And when I talk about textual analysis, I'm talking about analyzing quite different types of text. These texts could be newspaper articles. They can be different kinds of social media, blog posts, Twitter posts, Facebook posts. It could be government documents. It could be advertisements. It could be speeches from political figures, religious figures. It could be posters. It could be TV programs. So these texts can contain both written information, but also visual information that you analyze. The text you analyze using textual analysis are usually produced by others, and these texts are just collected by you and then analyzed. Sometimes researchers might also ask research participants to take photos that the researcher will analyze, or to write a text or diary entry or an essay for a school assignment that the researcher will then analyze. In textual analysis, and we'll talk more about this later, there are also a lot of different approaches to analyze these texts, and a lot of different strategies that we can use to make sense of this data material. Content analysis is one approach, thematic analysis, discourse analysis, narrative analysis, etc., etc. And we'll talk more about some of these approaches later on in this video series about qualitative research methods. So I hope this video was useful in order to help you get an overview of different research methods that are used in qualitative research, and also some more information about when it is appropriate to use these different research methods. Thank you for watching.